Okay, so here we go. We are starting a new topic. Here we are with topic 11, an era of change. In this topic, we are going to be learning really about a time of transition from, the ideas of the 50s and 60s into the 80s and 90s, really. We're going to be spanning a lot of time. So, in this particular topic, we're going to talk about some of the protest movement, although we did talk about a good deal of that with the Vietnam War. But we'll be talking about an increase in rights for many individuals, from LGBTQ to the disabled to Native Americans. So many different groups of people coming into their own civil rights advocacy during this time period. We'll also be looking a little bit more at youth culture. And then later we'll be talking about environmentalism. We'll be talking about Richard Nixon and Watergate, the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So all of those things, this is a pretty diverse chapter. I think that the topic title, An Era of Change, is pretty apt because we're just sort of bridging us into the more modern world. So, looking forward to the next couple of topics. There's a topic about Reagan and Clinton, Obama and Trump. There's not too much about Trump because obviously that's extremely recent, just a mention of his name as the winner of the 2016 election. So that's where we are. This is where we're going. And let's start. So here are our terms, and you can see that it really spans a lot of what we went over. Counterculture, or what I just mentioned, counterculture, the generation gap, the Beatles, to feminism with Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, let's see, environmentalism, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, the 25th Amendment, as a response to Watergate, the end of the Cold War with détente and SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and then issues in the Carter administration, fundamentalism, sanctions, televangelists. So it's like, we don't know where to put this stuff. Let's throw it all into one topic together. So bear with me as we move through this diverse topic. Can we describe the rise of counterculture? Can we list major characteristics of counterculture? Can we evaluate the positive and negative impacts of counterculture on American society? Can we analyze why a movement to expand women's political rights rose in the 1960s? Can we identify the goals and methods that political organizations used to promote women's rights? Can we assess the impact of the women's movement on American society? Can we analyze the causes of the growth of the Latino population after World War II? Can we evaluate significant leaders and the methods they used to achieve equality and political rights for Latinos? Can we evaluate the means by which Native Americans sought to expand their rights? Can we describe the expansion of rights for consumers and the disabled? Can we assess the causes and effects of the environmental movement? Analyze why environmental protection became a controversial issue? Describe Richard Nixon's leadership in foreign policy? Define Nixon's foreign policy towards China and the Soviet Union? Can we describe Richard Nixon's attitude toward big government? Can we analyze Nixon's Southern strategy? Can we describe the effects of the Watergate political scandal? Can we evaluate the presidency of Gerald Ford? Can we evaluate Ford's foreign policies? Can we assess the domestic policies of Jimmy Carter, discuss changing U.S. foreign policy in the developing world, and analyze how American society changed in the 1970s? So we're pulling through the 70s here. Many of the generation born after the challenging times of the Great Depression and World War II are going to embrace a different worldview than most of their parents, a worldview that found dramatic expression in the counterculture movement that arose in the 60s. Members of the counterculture adopted values that ran counter to mainstream culture, right? Hence the name counterculture. They rebelled against long-standing customs in dress, music, and personal behavior. The counterculture both challenged the values of mainstream America and provoked a counter movement to reassert traditional values. This is the baby boomer generation here. Um, these this these young people who are challenging mainstream culture that a lot of times today are teased for being mainstream culture. At one point in time, they were on the cutting edge of what it meant to be American and have an American culture. But as it says, there's going to be a reaction, right? For as far as these individuals are going to be pushing this social and cultural envelope, there are going to be many others who pull back to this more traditional idea of what American culture is. American post-war prosperity does not extend to everyone, and what you see a lot of these boomers doing as they go to college is calling out mainstream cultural values for ideas of conformity. Do you guys remember that song that I played on the topic before last, Little Boxes? This idea that everyone grows up and goes to college and has a family and everything is the exact same for everyone, no matter what. So they're challenging two things. One, they're challenging the idea of conformity, right? They value freedom over conformity, and they feel mainstream culture values conformity over freedom. They're also challenging the idea that prosperity extends to all. They say prosperity doesn't extend to all, and they would like to be more inclusive in terms of the groups that prosperity does extend to. This is the era when baby boomers are going to college, and you have in the United States 58% of the population under the age of 35. Of course, now we have a good deal of our population that's older, but in the 60s, 58% of the population is under 35. That's an incredibly young population, really pushing the boundaries here and creating this idea of a counterculture. The youth movement doesn't last forever, but it does have a lasting impact. I'm going to play you a Bob Dylan song. There he is down there in the bottom left that sort of epitomizes what we're talking about here with changing times. I'm in charge, so you have to deal with it.
If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, for the times they are changing. Some writers and critics, you prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are changing. On senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he that gets hurt will be he who is stalled. For the battle outside raging will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing. Our mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are changing. The line it is drawn and the curse it is cast. The slowest one now will later be fast, as the present now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will later be last, for the times they are changing.
I love that song so much. All right, you had to indulge me. In the 60s and 70s, American women launched a broad-based movement to expand economic opportunities and attain equal rights. The women's movement fundamentally changed many aspects of American life. from family and education to careers and political issues. Today, the contributions of people of various gender groups continue to shape American culture. So the 60s and 70s, as this picture caption says, witnessed a broad-based struggle for equal rights among women in the United States. We had the vote, and by we I mean women. I'm including myself in this category. So women are able to vote, of course, under Wilson, but women don't achieve this equal rights amendment that many women's groups had advocated for at the time. So here we are 40, 50 years later, still advocating in the 60s and 70s for the passage of this Equal Rights Amendment that essentially says that women cannot be discriminated against because they are women. Several years after she wrote The Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan, who's an important vocab term person, Betty Friedan helped establish the National Organization for Women, which some of you guys may have even heard of. It's called NOW. The organization, which dedicated itself to winning, quote, true equality for all women and to attaining a full and equal partnership of the sexes, galvanized the women's movement. And this is an image from 1978, where over 100,000 women marched in Washington, D.C. to demand that Congress extend the deadline for the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. There's a lot of pushback to the Equal Rights Amendment. It ultimately is never passed. But in the Supreme Court later on, a very important Supreme Court justice named Ruth Bader Ginsburg will do a lot of work both while she's on the Supreme Court and before she's on the Supreme Court, actually arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court, arguing that women cannot be discriminated against on the basis of sex. There's a really important book about her called On the Basis of Sex, or maybe it's a movie. I'm blanking. But anyway, she's very important to the women's movement. Betty Friedan, the leader of NOW, and then a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who is against the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, arguing that the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment would essentially turn women into men and strip away their femininity. If you are a feminist, all it really means is you believe that women should be treated equal to men, that women should have this equality of opportunity to men. There's, I think, a misconception that feminism is about elevating women over men. And if there are so-called feminists out there calling for that, movement forward of women at the expense of men, then those are not true feminists, I would argue. Feminism is about equality, not one over the other. There's Betty Friedan, and an important quote from her: "A girl should not expect special privileges because of her sex, but neither should she adjust to prejudice and discrimination." So again, feminism is simply the belief that men and women should be treated equally. Popular post-war emphasis on a traditional home life in the domestic role for women, even though they stepped into new jobs and new roles during World War II, is a pushback to this, right? And there were a lot of women who had gone into the workplace in World War II and then didn't really want to leave when the men came home. They enjoyed working outside the home. And again, that's what feminism strikes at the heart at, is this choice. Let's say you are in a position to be able to choose if you stay home or go to work. You can absolutely be a feminist and stay home, right? Absolutely. There's so much value in that as a stay-at-home mother, right? But you should have the choice, feminists would argue, if you wanted to be engaged in the workplace. You should be allowed to be engaged in the workplace. And Betty Friedan, in 1963, writes an important book called The Feminine Mystique, where she argues that some, not all women, are unhappy in the home, which is a very controversial thing to say, that she says not all women want to be this sort of 1950s idealized version of an American housewife. I think it sounds good personally, but I'm not in a position to choose. The women's movement affected all aspects of American society. Gosh. Women's roles and opportunities will expand. Women gain legal rights that had been denied them. And feminists spark important debates about equality that continue, as we know, until today. Yet the issues they raise continue to divide Americans. Some said that women haven't made enough gains even today, and others worry that this movement of women outside of the home actually harms society. And I mentioned that Phyllis Schlafly and Betty Friedan were sort of opposed to one another. But I should also mention Gloria Steinem. So Gloria Steinem is a journalist who advocates for equal rights for women. And here's a quote of hers. Sex and race, because they are easily visible differences, have been the primary ways of organizing human beings into superior and inferior groups and into the cheap labor on which this system still depends. Phyllis Schlafly is an opponent of Gloria Steinem's. She is not a feminist. She says, quote, feminism is doomed because it attempts to repeal and restructure human nature. Women have babies and men provide support. If you don't like the way we're made, you've got to take it up with God. We'll leave that there. One of the ways these issues of women's rights, and this is going to sound silly, plays out is through sport. They're very famously a really wonderful tennis player named Billie Jean King, who some of you guys may have heard of, says she can play just as good as any man. And a male tennis player named Bobby Riggs says, oh yeah, play me, let's go, let's have a tennis match, let's see who would win. And in 1973, Billie Jean King defeated Bobby Riggs in this very famous battle of the sexes, who would win, the male or female tennis player, and she won. Title IX, I mentioned sports, right? Title IX is essentially this idea that if you're going to spend money on a male sport, you have to provide women an equal opportunity to have a sport. So it doesn't, like in football, it doesn't mean you have to have like a women's football team, but it would mean that you would have to have some sort of women's sport that you were investing in. Maybe softball or something like that, right? There are issues of wage equality in various different sectors of the population. Men still do make more money than women. There's all kinds of debates about that are ongoing even today. And also, if you just look overall, there are professions that are paid less because they tend to be female-dominated professions. I'm looking at teaching as one of them. There are some people who argue if, teaching was mostly a male profession, would teachers be paid more? I'm not trying to start a fight, guys. I'm just trying to throw some things out there to think about, right? One of the big debates, and my husband and I have this conversation all the time, is about women's soccer. So women's soccer, they don't get as much money as men's soccer, like the national team. But the argument is that men's soccer makes more money, but women's soccer is better, and more people tuned in at the last World Cup to watch the women's national team play. So there's all kinds of back and forth debates. And there are lots of reasons why women may not get paid as much. If we talk about family leave and maternity leave, which is generally unpaid leave, women oftentimes leave the workplace for a year, while they are having their babies, 2 years, 3 years, while they're raising the children. And then when they go back, they don't have the same opportunity that they did before they left. So all kinds of things. It's a very complicated issue and all kinds of things go into it, but it's certainly an issue that does exist that we can't just not talk about because it's controversial, right? The last topic we talked about before spring break was, 2 topics ago before spring break was civil rights. And so the civil rights and women's movement together are going to signal this growing groundswell for revolution, right? For ideas, revolutionary ideas of equality, I should say. Latinos, Native Americans, Asian Americans engaged in their own struggle for equality during the 60s and 70s, fighting to influence laws and government. Meanwhile, activists will work to expand rights for 2 groups, consumers and people with disabilities. There's a huge surge in the Latino population. Based on the information on the chart, how much did the Latino population increase in the U.S. from 1970 to 2010? We'll be doing some work as to why. Mexican immigration increases in the early 1900s, especially in Texas and Southern California. Um, there are lots of issues during the Great Depression, where prior to the Great Depression, the United States, remember, had that Bracero program where they're bringing in Latinos to farm the American Southwest. But then when financial crises hit, those same people who were invited to come in and work are chased out. You also see a swell of immigration from Puerto Rico. Remember, Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. And also from Cuba, people fleeing the communist regime in Cuba. But as they increase in numbers, the discrimination against them will increase as well. Millions of Mexican immigrants come to the United States through the Bracero program. How did their arrival affect the U.S. economy? Positively. Positively. Spoiler alert. Like other minorities, Latinos had long faced discrimination. After World War II, Latino veterans began agitating for equal treatment. A veteran named Hector Garcia formed the American GI Forum to battle discrimination for vets. In the 1960s and 70s, influenced by the growing civil rights movement, Latinos increasingly fought for equal rights. They demanded better working conditions, salaries, and educational opportunities. Like African Americans, they sought federal protection of their right to vote and campaigned to elect politicians who represented their interests. This is Cesar Chavez. He's the leader of the United Farm Workers, which is a really important union dedicated to help improve working conditions of migrant workers in the fruit and vegetable industry, who are crucial to the American economy. Cesar Chavez, side note, like contemporary thing, Joe Biden has a bust of Cesar Chavez behind his desk in the Oval Office. It was one of the first things that people noticed on day one of his presidency, so a pretty fascinating moment. Native Americans have a long history of discrimination. We know in this country that they suffer from high rates of poverty, unemployment, and suicide even today. But they do begin their own protest movements in the 60s and 70s. This is Russell Means. He's right in the middle. On the right, that's a man named Dennis Banks. And there are early leaders, and most people remember the name Russell Means, of AIM, or the Native or the American Indian movement, who they do some really interesting things. One of the things that they do is they take over Alcatraz, they occupy it, they say this is native territory, everyone else needs to get out. And so they use a lot of variety of means, including some violent incidents, to bring the struggle for rights to the public's attention. Remember, Native Americans are a small minority, and we mentioned some of those significant challenges. This is them in Alcatraz, where it says, well, in Indian's land, welcome Indian. Unemployment is 10 times the national average for Native Americans. In 1961, you have the Declaration of Indian Purpose, which is essentially asking for federal assistance to deal with some of the issues. In 1968, you have Indian Civil Rights Act, born out of a lot of these struggles. And then this militant group, AIM, or the American Indian Movement, from 1968 to 1969. In 1973, they also occupy Wounded Knee. In 1975, Congress passes the Indian Self-Determination and Educational Assistance Act, which brings Native Americans into the process of administering many federal programs, so allows Native American groups to be in charge of Native American programs. And Supreme Court cases will rule on issues of sovereignty and business ownership, essentially saying if in a state gambling is illegal on a reservation, you can gamble. So that's why a lot of times you'll see casinos spring up on Indian land, right, as they call it, on reservation territory, even though it's illegal to have a casino in that state, that it would be legal for them. In the same way that many activists work to expand the rights of women and minorities to protect the environment, which we will get to, others work to protect the rights of consumers and Americans with disabilities. So you have legislation or events like the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, which has never passed. You have the Panel on Mental Retardation, which is a term that is not in use anymore, from 1961, but it explored ways the government could help people with disabilities. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is added in 1964, which outlaws sex-based discrimination. Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 erased or eased restrictions, making immigration easier for Latinos and Asians. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966 mandates safety equipment in cars. Y'all, you've got to put a seatbelt on, maybe an airbag or two. And then the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975 gives Native Americans control over their own resources on reservations. Americans with disabilities are increasingly leaving institutions and living on their own. It used to be that if you had a child with a disability, one of the first things that you did was try to find a group home for them to live their life in. Whether they were, mentally disabled or physically disabled, it didn't matter. But increasingly, you start to see disabled groups advocate for themselves and say, we need access to public facilities just like everyone else. We deserve to live on our own independently. And we deserve to be able to work somewhere that has, handicap access. So in 1968, you have the Architectural Barriers Act, which leads to building new constructed buildings. If they're going to use federal funds, they have to be accessible to persons with disabilities. You have the Rehabilitation Act of 73, specifically Section 504, which some of you guys may even have a 504 plan. That's where that name comes from. States that no person with a disability can be discriminated against in any way by any entity that receives federal funding. The American Coalition of Citizens with Disability launches protests to demand that those Section 504 is enforced. And in 1975, all kids with disabilities receive a free and equal education, appropriate education, no matter what. And in 1990, we have the ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act, which goes further than any of the other acts had before. And then this is a great picture from 2013, the Special Olympics Winter Games. The first Special Olympics is held in Chicago in 1968. And we have an activity on this, but in the 1960s, the civil rights movement will influence LGBT people to become bolder in their struggle against homophobic laws and social attitudes. You have the Stonewall riots in the 60s in New York City, and we will see an increasing emergence of the gay rights movement to make LGBTQ, the Q, people more visible. And we know that today in this country, because of the struggles of those early civil rights pioneers, same-sex marriage is legal. The discrimination against LGBTQ people is illegal. But there are still issues being fought out in the courts surrounding religious exemptions. So we will leave that there, and we will pick up with the environment.